It's 2012. Man, I'm sorry. Yeah, so we got to walk through 2012. And so sitting in the building with us from KPOO, our sister station in San Francisco, is Harrison Chastain, the news director over there. Welcome to the show, Harrison.
Thank you.
We have from Color of Change. These are people that's been on the ground. Every time there's an issue, they've been leading the charge, from voter suppression on down. Arisha, how you doing? What's your last name, Arisha?
Arisha Hatch.
Arisha Hatch, that's right. And then we have a man who's been all over the planet. I mean, this year he's been in Australia, London. He's been here, Alaska, Oakland. Anywhere that there's been a hot spot, he's been there. Mr. Mark Gonzalez. And then lastly, on the phone with us, and Gonzalez with an S. That's right. Make sure you get it with an S. And then on the phone with us from Huffington Post Live, we know her from D.C., but now she's in L.A. Alyona, how you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. It's HuffPost Live.
It's HuffPost Live. How's it going for you over there? Is it good?
It's great. It's a really fun new project. It's something that just launched in August, and we won a Mashable Innovation in the Media Index Award last week. It's a totally new format. It's all online streaming, and thus far, I think the people are really loving it. It's something that's brand new. I'm excited to see it develop.
Okay, well, great. So let's start off, and maybe I'll start off with you, Alyona. What is one of the big key issues that stood out for you this year? There were so many to choose from, but maybe two that really just had you going, man, we got to talk about this.
Well, oh God, there is a lot. I like to talk, but it depends on whether these are issues that we want to say that everyone is talking about, right? The big stories that are out there, or the stories that are kind of undercovered. And so, I'll just start off with some of the things that I think that don't get quite the attention. And so, one thing that we saw this year was a lot of outrage, a lot of anger from Congress directed at the White House over selective leaking to the press, right? And we saw a lot of information be put out there about kill lists, about possible, cyber warfare that we were waging against Iran. And there was so much anger on the Hill. But to me, the biggest problem with this, and it really shows where we are as a country in this, post 9/11 war and terror state of mind still, is the anger from Congress is directed at the White House for the active leaking, which is something that happens in Washington all the time. There's a huge double standard there, too, in terms of who gets in trouble for it and who doesn't. And they weren't actually angry or felt the need to investigate, the fact that we have a president that used to be a constitutional law professor that has just completely changed the dynamic and expanded Bush-era policies to the point where now we have a kill list, right?
Right.
He meets with his team on Tuesdays, and they decide who is going to be assassinated via drone strike remotely, via airstrike. And, at times this has been American citizens. We know that it happened to Anwar al-Awlaki, his 16-year-old son, something that the administration has never even spoken about. And so the fact to me that that's what Congress is angry over, or that isn't what is really disturbing to them. And, this disposition matrix, this entire institutionalization of this targeted assassination program by this administration. We also found out just the other week that, when they thought that Mitt Romney might actually win the election, they decided to start making a drone rule book, because who knows what might happen if this gets into the wrong hands. And this is, a really, really scary power. And this is where I feel like the left has failed in standing up, in being heard, in, they've totally just accepted this because they think that, if this power is in the hands of our benevolent and moral leader, Barack Obama, then it must be okay, and we just don't want Mitt Romney doing it. And all of that it's just so wrong. And that's very scary to me. But I think that we've seen that line carry throughout the year with numerous reports, that come out about how much this program expands, about the institutionalization of it, and the fact that Congress, for the most part, is turning a blind eye. There is finally a hearing on the Hill last week where we saw some members of Congress asking for more information on drone strikes, and yet they voted down a bill by Dennis Kucinich, who actually wanted to have the administration explain their legal policy, how it is that they justify being able to have these powers. And yet that, for some reason, didn't get the vote. So,
Right.
it's really not going anywhere. That didn't play a big role in the election.
Well, let's just hold it there on the drones, because that's a big thing. I know in the Bay Area we're dealing with a big fight about the Alameda County Sheriff bringing drones in. I think Berkeley is getting ready to try and pass a resolution to have a drone free airspace, and they're trying to see what jurisdiction they actually have. But I think alongside of what you've been talking about with the drones and the drone rule book, which also has been underreported, is the fact that there's a drone lobby and there's a drone caucus in Congress. And in 2 years, private corporations will be able to own drones themselves. So the Clear Channels and the Walmarts and the Bechtels and the Koch brothers can all own drones in 2 years' time. And there's been no discussion as to what they'll be allowed to do and what they won't be allowed to do. And so we're going to have to put drones on a list of things that coming into 2013, we're going to have our muscles up. Harrison, what stood out for you? Harrison Chastain from KPOO.
Speaking of drones, tech is one big issue that we talked about on KPO in the past year, and how tech is impacting jobs. And right now is a tech boom in San Francisco. Twitter just moved onto Market Street. A bunch of other corporations, tech corporations, are moving in. And at the same time, there's at least 10 construction projects building 20, 30-story buildings that are connected to tech. But the question is, how many African Americans, how many Hispanics, how many low-income people in the Tenderloin and other parts of San Francisco are benefiting from this tech boom? It's very little.
Right.
And in the other aspect of technology, talking about these drones, can you imagine in a few years people work in the Central Valley who fly crop dusting planes being replaced by drones? Do you have people who work in other aspects of the world today? Google just introduced a driverless car. In 10 years from now, will that displace people working for Muni, people working for UPS? These are entry-level jobs. And as we see technology move more and more, we see fewer and fewer African Americans, fewer and fewer Hispanics who are in the decision-making positions in technology, and questions need to be raised how this technology will impact employment and overall income with people of color. And
Right. No, go ahead.
And just one other issue, big issue, has been the election. And it was predicted at the beginning of this election cycle that few African Americans were going to come out to vote. It was a one-time thing in 2000. Everybody was excited with President Barack Obama, the first African American president. That wasn't going to happen again. President Barack Obama might be in trouble if fewer African Americans showed up, same with many African American members of Congress, particularly here in California, where you have reapportionment, where several African American members of Congress and the state legislature were pitted against each other, were pitted against other Democrats. And also on the East Coast and elsewhere, you had conservative black ministers who were upset with the president supporting same-sex marriage. They were predicting that 20% of African Americans were going to go and vote for Republican candidates. And you also have 5 African Americans who are running as GOP candidates, Tea Party candidates. They all lost. But another issue, President Barack Obama, as we know, won with anger because of voter suppression, and that backfired, and many African Americans came out to vote despite the best efforts of the Republicans and the Tea Party to suppress African American voters. But on the flip side, you have fewer African Americans getting elected to office. You have now almost no African American mayors of big cities. There were no black senators elected. We just had one appointed yesterday from the Republican side. And there are no African Americans representing the Bay Area and the state legislature. And out of 290 county board of supervisors, you have 2 in San Francisco.
So basically, gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering.
And redistricting that came about in 2010 when people didn't show up for stateside elections played out in a very big way, and that's something to consider. Going back to the situation about the tech. I do remember that there were big protests in San Francisco. I know we covered them when Twitter came there, with people living in those impoverished areas demanding that either San Francisco charge them the tax rate or they start hiring people. I think they had a list of demands, and we'll have to kind of revisit that. Arisha, Color of Change, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Step right into the mic there. So what has been a couple of big issues that you all have been really hitting on that, kind of define 2012?
Right. So we've been hitting on a lot of issues around voter suppression, voter ID that I think were big stories this season, this year, although they were sort of swept under the rug by the amazing turnout by Black and Latino and Asian American folks and young people and single women across the nation.
Right.
And so for me, one of the themes that I feel like we didn't explore, or because, the fiscal cliff happened so quickly after the election, the conversation moved to the fiscal cliff, was sort of this new coalition that emerged, this emerging majority coalition of Black people, of Latino people, of Asian Americans, of women, of single women, of young people that sort of came out. And I think, if you were watching Fox News the night of the election, you sort of saw them talk a little bit about that demographic shift. But we haven't had, I think, a lot of conversations about what it means to not only turn those people out, but what it means to govern under this idea of this new majority and what sort of like policies will we
Well, that happened in 2008, and we didn't see a lot. And people kind of gave that president, let him just get used to the job. Now he's used to the job, and now we're dealing with everything else but, this new coalition. I think one of the interesting things to underscore is that there were direct attacks on various members of this coalition. There was a war on women. There was a war on Latinos/immigrants. There was a war on young Blacks. There was a war on Muslims. There was a war on everybody, and everybody wound up coming out. But there hasn't, as you said, conversation, and so we'll have to revisit that. What was another key thing that you all did? Voter suppression, this coalition.
Yes, this voter suppression coalition, and we saw many instances of folks, Republicans, conservatives, targeting the Black vote. So we saw in Ohio and Wisconsin, they were shooting up all these billboards on Clear Channel, billboards saying, voting, voter fraud is a felony. And, these are sort of all the crimes. And we saw at Color of Change, we saw sort of reiterated the ability for us as organizers, as online organizers, to push back against corporations who are willing to put out these types of messages.
Okay.
And so we were sort of successful in pushing Clear Channel to take down these billboards from our communities. And for us, it's sort of a reiteration of this model of pushing back against corporations who seek to do negative work in the communities that we care about.
Okay. Mark, what did you see this year? Mark Gonzalez, poet, educator, scholar.
Well, as I think
talking to that mic there.
Well, as I think back across the year, I think when we've talked about this a lot, the rate through which we're consuming information makes us only remember things in the last month or two. And I think we have to go back to the beginning of the year, to January 2012. And even if we look at December of 2011 as part of the beginning of the year, that we have to actually place the collective energy, both of the society as well as the planet, of what was happening with Occupy.
Yes.
And being here in Occupy Oakland, and even beyond whether people or not agree with the political vision of Occupy, what was happening with people gathering collectively in a space and saying, we're taking this place in order to create a base, and from that base we want to hold a cross conversation across parts of society and then decide actions from that.
Right.
And what was beginning to shift from those gatherings. And then in January of 2012, I actually began the year leaving a residency in Stanford, where if you want to talk about tech, what was happening in terms of these open coding classes that Stanford and MIT were beginning to offer to the planet.
Yes.
Online, with 50 to 70,000 people enrolled, and how that was beginning to change the conversation around university and what it means to pay for an education versus education being accessible to everyone. Heading to Beirut for a conference on basically American empire and people gathering across from the planet in Beirut, and attending an Occupy Beirut gathering, and then heading from there to London in the buildup to the U.S. Olympics and the global Olympics there, and looking at what was happening with the home demolition, and from there to Germany, and holding a conversation with people across ethnicities in Berlin who were basically trying to speak about what does a new German identity look like when so much of Berlin is informed by people across the planet, heading from there then to Tunisia for several weeks. And Tunisia having the beautiful, difficult question of how do we redefine a society after 40 years of emotional, structural, political suppression? And what happens when the voices that have been imprisoned for so long are actually put together face to face for the first time?
Wow.
And what are all the difficulties that come from that? And then heading from there, to Australia, to New Zealand, to New Caledonia, which is, quote, a French colony, originally Cannockland, which is coming up for an independent referendum in 2 years by the independents, by the people who originally lived there. And I find that if you're asking globally what is going on in this moment, I find that rather than have a question about structurally what is going on, I'm more interested in what are the questions that seem to be happening across societies. And I find two primary questions being asked by people across this planet is, what is the role of emotions in our global reality? And what does the future of empire look like in our global reality?
Right.
And how that there seems to be a shift in people, that there is a collective belief in possibility emerging. And that's what I find actually a lot of things when you look at more how larger power structures are positioning themselves right now. Part of it is structural in terms to economy, but I actually believe a lot of it more has to do with the economy of emotions, that people are actually beginning to form more decentralized models of connecting with one another, and that this old one-center power in the middle of everything structure does not know how to respond to that.
Right.
So they're putting out things in so many different ways because people across this planet are actually connecting and linking with each other in more innovative ways than I've seen.
Right, and that's very true. And I want to go back to this, and Ayana, if you could jump in on this. He mentioned about Occupy, and many people almost forget when you talk about what was happening in the beginning of the year. We forget about what was going on with Occupy. We forget that there was a lot of dismantling that we saw, and it's been erased from collective memory. Generally speaking, it's not talked about in the news and all that other stuff. And what I see as a theme, and hopefully you can comment on this, I see a lot of very systematic erasing of news and information. As you said, we don't remember after a year. You started off by talking that here are some stories that were underreported. But I also see a thread where we are distorting information. We're putting things out. Let's put a Lincoln story out and let's rewrite history in that. Let's misreport stories. Let's put false leaders up. All these sorts of things seem to be playing out in ways that we haven't seen before. What's being taught in schools, the challenges that are going on there. Let's remove this. Let's replace it with that. So I wanted to maybe dig into your brains a little, because you really have specialized in unearthing a lot of these under the radar stories. But do you see an attempt to kind of marginalize and actually dismiss some of these important things, including the ones that you had mentioned at the start around drones?
Of course. I think that there's a large effort to try to dismiss this kind of information. And that's because, these are the type of themes that we see carry through that I think make people uncomfortable. Your prior guest was talking, about what's happening around the world. This was a year of many elections in many different parts of the world. This was a year of unrest. If you look at what's going on, not only within the Arab Spring, but also what's happening, in Europe too. We are seeing the economy have a very deep effect. I mean, clearly there are cultural, implications in other countries as well. But when you do have a young population, a young educated population, that commodity prices are going up, the jobs aren't there, right? Then a lot of this economic turmoil then tends to breed some of that unrest, which I think that we're seeing people act out on. And I think that the Occupy movement is also an element of that, because people are frustrated as they feel that there is a global elite, essentially, that is running everything, that's finding themselves moving farther and farther away from the general population. The wealth gap is only increasing. These people are only becoming richer. You have a financial system which, despite the financial crash in 2008, hasn't really changed in any way. And who else, everyone else are the ones that are suffering, whether it's through austerity measures in Europe or here in the United States. Look at the foreclosure crisis, another thing that completely has not been addressed, another thing that completely made its way out of the election. And I do think that there is an effort there to try to remove it, not necessarily remove it from the collective consciousness, but these are things that are really difficult to talk about. And I think that we have a very lazy media structure, especially a very lazy mainstream media, because it's so much easier to play a soundbite, that a politician, maybe they said something earlier that day, and so then you get you to just loop it on repeat, and you have people talking about general themes, but you're not really getting down into the crux of it. And we focus on partisan issues as if our two parties are really so different and so divided. And sure, maybe they differ on tax policy, but again, you're not going, you're not seeing a lot of unification of people trying to reform our national security policy, trying to reform the financial industry,
right,
trying to look at what happened with housing. All of that is still there, and it still has yet to be addressed. And so, that to me is part of the problem. But if I can just make one more point on that too, what I think that we did see in response to, congressional approval ratings being as low as they've ever been, to this do-nothing Congress that people want to say, to a frustration over the media whitewashing a lot of these stories too, is maybe it's not, maybe they're not re-embracing it, but we did see states' rights play a very large role in America this year, and we've seen it be used for good and for bad, right? And we've seen it try to restrict people's rights. If you want to talk about restrictive abortion legislation that passed all across the country, if you want to talk about voter ID laws and voter suppression, but then we also saw it try to expand rights in the form of gay marriage and state ballot initiatives, in the form of legalizing the recreational use of marijuana.
right.
And I think that people are trying to reclaim some of that on the local level because they feel like Congress isn't doing it. They're not talking about it. The media isn't talking about it either. You could look at the legalization of marijuana as a total refute of the drug war that's been a failure for 40 years. Again, another thing that is whitewashed, another thing that is never brought up in any presidential debate when you have the top journalists in the country moderating. So, I find a little hope in that, but I definitely feel like we aren't seeing the real honest discussions about major policy failures that we need to be.
That's the voice of Alyona Minsk. How do I pronounce your last name? I knew I was going to butcher it.
It's okay. I get it all the time. It's Alyona Minkowski.
Alyona Minkowski. I'm getting there. That's my goal for the new year is
2013, Davey. You'll get it.
I'm going to pronounce everybody's name correctly. Let me toss this out to everybody here, building off of what you just said. There's been a lot of unrest around the world that hasn't been covered here. 1 million people in Quebec, Montreal. Have people forgotten about that? That was something that you didn't see on the evening news. Chile, you saw 500,000 people out there around education. Same thing with the scenario in Quebec. And I bring these up because...
In Mexico,
I was going to bring that up as well. You've seen large amounts of young people who have been coming out to not a few hundred, but tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, and that's been completely erased, as we also erased the Occupy, which we're linking up with these larger movements. And couple that with the efforts, and I'll toss this to you, Arisha, the organizing efforts that we've seen that have gone on with young people in particular. You know, it wasn't the Jesse Jacksons and Al Sharptons, but it was a lot of young people. It was young college students that first led that charge with Trayvon Martin, where we had a lot of shootings going on, racial shootings going on. It was young people in Mississippi that were doing a lot of organizing. You saw a lot of this voter suppression kickback. I was in Charlotte when I saw 1,000 people from the hood, you know, participating without an Al Sharpton and everybody. So from the work that you all have been doing to get a lot of folks, can you talk about maybe that youth activism, how, as you may have seen it domestically, and maybe you can chime in as to how you've seen it internationally, Mark?
Right. I think it's not only
Talk right into that mic there.
Not only the youth activism, but sort of like this online activism that sort of allows a lot of people to be involved in ways that they weren't able to be involved before, and connected with others in a way that they weren't able to be connected with others. And so we've seen it, like you said, with Trayvon and the sort of social media online push, and also sort of offline rallies that were pushed to make the major media pay attention to what was going on. And we've seen it in other sort of like countless examples like that.
Were you frustrated that these things didn't always get the coverage?
Frustrated, but not
surprised.
Not surprised, and unwilling to feel defeated by it,
Right.
because I don't feel like it's worth putting that much energy into. Put your energy into things that you can change and can affect.
But has that changed the way in which you organize now? Because you're not going to be able to depend upon certain places that traditionally we have.
Right. No, it definitely changes the way that we organize. And one of our big emphasis for the coming year will be a culture accountability, media accountability project that is really going to be focused on media to tell the stories, and the way you were talking earlier, sort of offline, about gun violence, and the way that we're sort of talking about Black gun violence versus gun violence in white communities, and really sort of taking an active look at and pushing back on the media against those sort of representations to make sure that they're telling the stories that are important to be told for our communities.
Mark, can you chime in on the international organizing that we've seen that was blacked out here,
yes.
white outed here?
So in the student protests in Quebec, I think what's important to remember is they released a really powerful document. And I think one of the things people who are interested really in understanding not just the sound bites that are going on globally from a different perspective, but really understanding that people are engaged in transforming their local reality with the global vision. It's not an either-or conversation anymore. And so on the ground, people are having these conversations and releasing documents about their personal and political philosophy with which they're moving forward. So in Quebec, when the student protests were going on over the tuition hikes, I remember the document they released specifically said, raising this tuition makes education inaccessible to the rest of us, and that is a declaration of war on our future.
Right.
And to really think just about that language.
And that's pretty much what they said in Chile.
Yes, which was echoed. And then being in Vanuatu, which is a sovereign indigenous island in the South Pacific, and building with the Youth Against Corruption movement, who was organizing intergenerationally against kind of the, checkbook and pocket type of political organizing that has been going on for the last several centuries. Being in France, when you look at so much of the BDS, as well as in London, the Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions movement, that are organizing around the 64 plus years of occupation in Palestine by the Israeli government, that it's majority young people who are saying we have to address economically how these structures are affecting us both domestically, and then how that domestic taking of resources is then being used to harm people in other places of the planet.
Right.
And how is it that we're accepting that you're taking money away from us? You are taking money away from us to harm other people in parts of the planet.
Okay. That's the voice of Mark Gonzalez. I appreciate that. We're going to take a break for 1 minute, and we're going to come back and we're going to continue this. I had a technical difficulty for a second, so just give me a second.
Which is, we don't remember things through statistics, which is how so much of the news is presented to us. Remember things, and we make sense of the world through stories. Mm-hmm. And so we're not engaging with other people's stories, and specifically stories add an emotional element to a narrative.
Right.
And when we hear them, it syncs with us and it affects us. I feel part of the reason why we're not connecting with the global reality, or if we're even aware of it, is because we're not presented with the emotional narrative of what people are seeing and what people are frustrated with and what people are dreaming. And so therefore, it's not staying with us.
Right.
Because when a person is affected emotionally and they hear something emotionally, such as with the recent shootings in Connecticut, which is a really emotional story that needs to be shared nationally and globally. But there's so many other stories that also need to be shared emotionally and globally that are only presented as statistics, and therefore we just hear it and then we forget it.
It's been academized, if we could use that word. Harrison Chastain, and then I want to bring in Kai Wright from Color Lines, who is joining us on the line as we are looking back at the year 2012. One big story is a different type of shift. And we talked about this last time you came on our airwaves with our traditional civil rights organizations, once considered the conscience of America, and we've seen a corporatizing of them. It played itself out in a very ugly way with Prop 37 here in California, where we saw the NAACP and we saw not the Urban League, but the Black Chamber of Commerce. And there was a long list of people who lined up alongside Monsanto and all those groups that we've been fighting for the past, umpteen years, and said, now we're in their corner, and they were like leading the charge. We saw this play out around the telecom, net neutrality, where you have a list of like 20 civil rights organizations lining up with AT&T. And you talked about that this has been an ongoing pattern, not just nationally, but locally. And it's now caused a very significant split in terms of when you see organizing going on. You have a lot of 20 and 30-something-year-olds who are on one side of the fence, and you have the traditional civil rights organizations on the other side, which a lot of times, more often than we hate, unless it's a police brutality issue, they're on the corporate side, and that's been kind of a challenge.
And there's this dichotomy, just using an example of the NAACP. You have the local chapters and you have the state chapters. Here in San Francisco, the local chapter is very proactive on issues like the measure against smoking. And that was another issue that the state NAACP cited with the cigarette industry. The local chapter was against that. Same with Prop 37. But when you people in California tried to interact with the heads of these organizations, the head of the Urban League in California, the head of the NAACP, the head of the Black Chamber of Commerce, you try to get them on the phone. We as journalists, we try to interview them. They're not available. They're not making any comments on these issues, but they're making these endorsements. And these endorsements seem to go depending on how much money they get from these entities, and they claim, no, we're not being paid off, but they're on the advertising. We're being supported by the NAACP, the state chapter of the NAACP. And it really turns off a lot of people. They're saying...
So what is that about now? Is that a generational thing, or is that a class thing, or what do you attribute to that?
It's about money. And more often these days, you got nonprofits, you got community organizations that are being squeezed out by budget cuts statewide or federally, and they got to get money from somewhere to survive. Many organizations have said, we are not going to sell our soul to bring in the money, but other organizations say, we got to survive. If we got to take money from the cigarette industry, we'll take it. We got to accept it from the chemical industry,
right.
We'll take it.
Well, we've seen a lot of that. We've seen a lot of organizations alongside with Walmart. We've seen them with the banks. In fact, one of the things, Color of Change has been like on that opposite side. That's one of the things that has been very marked is that, wow, like y'all a new civil rights organization, because the other one, many of them, not all, but quite a few, have been on the other side of key issues that we've been battling.
And right now, it's a big battle between Tavis Smiley and Cornel West. And Tavis says he needs to get his program on public radio, and we're on public radio right now, independent, non-commercial radio. And, everyone who listens to this station knows the struggles money-wise. Tavis says, hey, if I get that money from Walmart, if I get that money from Wells Fargo, the main entity, one of the main entities responsible for the subprime crisis that's put so many Black and Latin people in foreclosure, Tavis says, I don't have a problem with it. Now Tavis is being criticized from all corners for being a sellout, but he says, I got to do what I got to do to stay on the air.
Something to definitely think about. I want to bring Kai Wright in, editor-in-chief of Color Lines, a wonderful publication. And how you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Good, good. And I'm glad that you were able to come in and join us. I wanted to ask you, because you all have covered so much this year, what are some key things that really stood out for you all in 2012? And keeping in mind, since you're just joining, we talked about drones as one of the things, and we talked about some of the underreported protests that have been going on internationally. But for Color Lines, what are some of the things that you all really found to be a heart and soul that defined 2012?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a big year, right? And there's a lot to get in there. We're actually working on our end of the year stuff package right now, and trying to figure out how to squeeze it all in. And I think probably what emerges for me are three big themes more than individual events. And I'll try to tick them off real quick. I mean, one, we had this election this year, and I think the most obvious big theme that has come out of that is, people of color vote, and we're going to be voting, and and no amount of voter suppression effort is going to change that, and so both major parties are now having to think about what that means for them, both in terms of policymaking and in terms of their politics, and what the electoral landscape looks like, and importantly, communities of color and folks who are advocating for racial justice are also thinking about what that means for them, and what is power and how does it look. So one big theme is sort of a universal understanding of, at least in the realm of electoral politics, there's been a power shift. What does the word power mean, and how do we play it out? Another big shift is, I think, in the realm of immigration. I think we've seen this year a big change in how we think about immigration as a country. We've moved from talking about immigrants as workers or criminals, people who are either units of productivity in the economy or burdens on society, and started to talk about them as parents and children and neighbors.
That story thing you're talking about. Yes.
And I think as a consequence of that, you're seeing a very big shift in the way we think about and talk about immigration policy. That is owing in large part to the DREAM Act movement. And then finally, I think the least obvious and the most unsettling of is that I think we have ripped off in this year we've broken a silence that we've all agreed on over, I'd say, the past 2 decades about black men. Trayvon Martin's death forced into the public a conversation about the way, about both the physical reality that black men face in this society, ranging from the economics of it through to the violence, and the way we think about black men in this society. And I think that's the least obvious theme to emerge, but it's one that I think is really important and that we're going to be trying to drill down on at Color Lines next year.
Let me ask everybody here. Thank you, Kai Wright from Color Lines, and anybody can chime in. Along that line, one of the big stories that came out of the Malcolm X grassroots movement was that report, the Extrajudicial Killing report, that talked about, every 36 hours somebody black is murdered, either by law enforcement or somebody who is along the lines of security. And there's a website that deals with brown killings. And I know that they've been gathering a lot of information, and they're coming up with a lot of numbers as well. And complicating that is there's a lot of this vigilante killing that's been going on in brown communities. These things, especially leading up to the election, weren't talked about a lot, and many people, like myself, felt that was deliberate because people didn't want to mess up the election and get this whole thing. But it's a front and center issue here in Oakland, right now with all these killings. I mean, we just had a big thing, on Saturday at Eastside Arts Alliance, packed. Around the 36 hours thing, with people talking about it and strategizing for 2013. But let's talk about these very deliberate attacks on black and brown folks via the police, the reportage and where we see this and where it stood in 2012. And I'll go to you, Arisha, and then we'll make our way around the dial.
Yeah, I think we've seen gun violence and sort of this vigilante justice permeate black and brown communities for a while now. At Color of Change, we're particularly focused on this right-wing bill mill factory called the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, who is responsible for pushing at the state level a lot of these shoot first, stand your ground, whatever you call them, laws. And we see in our communities they have real impact, and they're connected to how the young men in our families are treated on an everyday basis. For us, what we've seen is these are intentional, concerted efforts on behalf of the gun lobby that definitely impact and
talk right into the mic. Yeah.
that definitely negatively impact our communities. And it's our hope that in 2013 that there are new opportunities to talk about.
But we have so much of that. The fact that we didn't have this as a national discussion, that it stopped, in our respective circles where we're at, and people would consider us all alternative. But that it wasn't, that it could be, we can have a big rally here, but it's not in the San Francisco Chronicle, and it's not on KTVU or any of the local stations, and we're right next door to them. So they see the rallies, they know the conversation, but it's not there. And what does that mean? Is this a continuation of devaluing life, or is this something else that's at play?
I think it's a manifestation of the disconnectedness that the major media has from our local communities. But it doesn't mean that we can't continue to force that conversation. It doesn't mean that we can't take the opportunities to show the connectedness between other events that might resonate more with them.
Right.
But I think that we saw through Trayvon. I think that we'll continue to see that we do have a power when we muster all of our energy together to bring those stories up to sort of a major narrative.
Iona, could you comment on that? And also just adding a little bit more fuel to that fire of physical attacks on people who have been marginalized. We've had these killings with black and brown folks, vigilante killings with a lot of brown folks, police shooting black folks. And then we had this whole justification for rape with women, in 2012, which people kind of forgot about. We had sitting senators and sitting Congress people, talk about, there's different types of rapes and, look you straight in the face and be dead serious. And it's and even try to push legislation to justify that. To me, all these things are kind of connected with I'm really going to war with you, and I'm going to pull out all the stops, and I don't care. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that and how that weighed with stories of this year.
Yeah, well, that's actually, that kind of flows into what I was saying before, too, in terms of being able to use the states as this, democratic laboratory for certain ideas. And sometimes it can be used in a positive light to expand people's rights. And at other times, people, try to use it to infringe on your rights. And, you have people talking about legitimate rape, whether women are asking for it. And it's really, it's sickening, but I think that it just reminds us all that there are, some really deep-rooted ideologies in this country, and that race and that sexism are still very much prevalent. We all know that we're not in a post-race type of society. And so these are things that you have to keep fighting against. And so that's why when you have a lawmaker come out and say something crazy like that and people don't understand why you want to attack him, they say, well, he's just a loon. Good. Let him know that line of thinking is no longer acceptable, and it's important when people talk like that and say these things off the cuff too, so that we can still realize that it very much exists, in the same way that, you can hear Mitt Romney on video saying that, talking about 47% of Americans, right? And this kind of disdain that he has for the poor and the elitism that he has, within him. But I think that, all this stuff is very important too to remember in terms of the conversation that we're having right now after this horrific horrific massacre that we saw in Newtown, Connecticut, at the elementary school.
Right. Well, it
Now
seems
everyone is talking about, gun violence, and yet people haven't really been talking about gun violence in Chicago. People haven't really been talking about a militarized police force and how that's affecting our society. And so, clearly, something, seeing elementary school students, murdered in cold blood like that is going to bring out the emotions. But this isn't a conversation that, that should be ignored for so long in terms of talking about gun violence in many different respects. And that, includes talking about perhaps a ban on assault rifles and whether we need, things that are military-grade weapons, how it is that poverty affects certain communities, how it is that police violence affects all of it, mental illness. It's all part of the conversation. And I've heard a lot of people try to say that we shouldn't have a knee-jerk reaction to Newtown. And I'm the first person to agree that we shouldn't have knee-jerk reactions to things. I think that we saw a lot of that post 9/11, and we saw a lot of our civil liberties taken away, and that's continued on because of that, because the government can overreact. But things like gun violence, that's not a knee-jerk reaction to something that just popped up yesterday.
No, it
It's
isn't.
been around for a long time.
I want to first of all thank our guests that have been here this afternoon: Mark Gonzalez, Arisha Hatch, Harrison Chastain, Ayanna from Huffington Post Live, and Kai Wright from Color Lines. As we get ready to move into 2013, predictions. What are you looking at? Your crystal ball is there. What do you see happening, or what do you think needs to happen? And I'll start off with you, Harrison. What do you think needs to happen? Then I'll go to you next, Ayanna.
Okay, several things that I think will happen in 2013. President Barack Obama will push to lift sanctions against Cuba. He'll appoint, if possible, a black Supreme Court justice if there's a vacancy. Here in California, the state legislature, which is now controlled by Democrats with a veto-proof majority, will revise Prop 13 to remove corporate tax loopholes, and the state will eliminate its deficit.
Okay, we're going to hold you to that. We're going to hold you to that. Ayanna, how you seeing this?
Oh, I hate the prediction game,
but you have to do it so we can play it back 6 months from now and go, you was wrong. You was nah.
Well, let me talk about what I think, what I hope happens, what I think needs to happen, which is I'd like to see, concrete moves on immigration reform. Seems like at this point, and I know that we say this all the time, how could you possibly ignore it anymore? But now the Republicans finally do have an incentive, which is realizing that they can't win any more elections unless they do somehow start to change their policy and change their stance on this. Then I would really like to see, some action on that. I am going to be watching the trial of Bradley Manning. He just turned 25 years old. Yesterday, this is the biggest classified, leaked case in the country's history, and he's been detained for over 2 years, and the trial won't even begin until March. And I really hope it is something that people start paying attention to, but I'm going to predict that they're going to ignore it either way. But I don't think that this kid should be charged with aiding the enemy and spend the rest of his life in jail over it. And I think that the economy is still going to be something that we struggle with, and it's going to affect every single part of our society, and I think that it's still going to be something that very much affects the rest of the world and the political movements and the ebb and flow of the tides there. As you still see a lot of people suffer, and like I said again, this wealth gap continues to rise, and the rich get richer, and I think that there's going to be more tension that rises up there. Not to be such a negative Nancy about it,
but you're just keeping it 100.
Okay. It does have a profound effect, I think.
Okay. Arisha, how you seeing this?
I'm seeing 2013. I'm hoping to see a robust conversation about immigration reform that moves beyond just immigration with a brown face. Mm-hmm. In my best vision of 2013, there's a discussion of immigration reform and sort of voting rights that's happening around the same time that takes into account these different the voter purge efforts that were happening in Florida and the voter ID efforts that were happening everywhere else. Mm-hmm. And so I'm hoping that this will be the equality movement and a vehicle to continue to build upon some of the efforts of the Black Civil Rights Movement.
Right.
And I'm hoping to see a continuation of the theme of sort of women and hopeful that Black women and this sort of, this discussion will sort of lead to broader policy changes.
Okay. Kai Wright, Color Lines, how are you seeing this?
Well, I think some folks are going to get their wishes. There will, in fact, be a discussion and, in fact, policy change on immigration in 2013. What exactly that will look like is anybody's guess. There's a lot of ground to be covered, but I predict there will be a bill in 2013. I predict there will, in fact, also we will have our conversation about voting rights because the Supreme Court is going to hear to challenge the Voting Rights Act. I believe in February.
Yes.
I think that whatever comes out of that is likely to force a broader conversation. I don't think it's going to be a favorable ruling, and I think that's going to force a congressional conversation about what to do with the Voting Rights Act. And then finally, I think, I hope, but I don't suspect that we will have a second stimulus because we need it. But I think the most important thing here is that we will continue to face unpredictable events. We will continue, as we have had for the last several years, to have large, unforeseen, unprecedented events that are the consequences of failed leadership on all of these issues that we've been talking about, which have all reached their critical point. And at some point, we will have a system shock that will force us to deal with them.
And how do we get a hold of you all? Colorlines.org.com?
Colorlines.com. We are here every single day. So come follow.
Okay. Ayanna, how do we get a hold of you? When is Huffington Post jumping off with you?
So HuffPost Live, we stream live 12 hours a day. I'm in our Los Angeles bureau, so that's from 3 to 7 p.m. Pacific time or 6 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Everything we do is archived, so just go to live.huffingtonpost.com and check out what we got going on.
And KPOO 89.5.
That's right, KPOO.com.
Okay, and Color Lines? I mean, not Color Lines is Kai, but your color of change.
Colorchange.org.
Okay.
Join the movement, become a member.
Okay, and then Mark Gonzalez, how are you seeing things for 2013?
I want to break it down into two different kind of visions, a social local vision and then a structural vision. I find that in 2013 and in the next couple years, you're going to continue to see a lot of geopolitical positioning over food and water.
Okay.
And specifically people in current positions of power really positioning their nation states and their militaries accordingly based upon food and water. The discourse, I believe, in those positions of power, which is historically based, will continue to be based in that way, which is on a homogenization of the rest of the planet as something other than us. And then I see social and local, those two things changing. People breaking a kind of dependency on a structural place as their sole reliance, not meaning it's completely an independent, but it's nothing that we no longer say that's where we're further going,
Right.
both for our food and water. And in doing so, starting to have a lot more, not only local conversations, but regional conversations in order to repair and heal our global imagination of what each other actually look like. Part of that really has to do with this kind of idea of we are dying. And we are really used to seeing ourselves in a coffin at a really early age, and that we cannot begin to discuss strategies unless we can actually repair our imagination to even see ourselves alive in 5 to 10 years. For a lot of our community, that is not a given. And I find that these 50-year visions, while are necessary, unless we can start to repair our imagination of like, I will be here in 5 years, what would I look like? What would I like that to look like? Every other conversation comes secondary. One conversation I would love to see on 2013 in Huffington Post Live, I love you all, but I'm going to have to put you on blast for a moment, which was a tweet you had put out earlier today, is how do we help our mentally ill children? I believe we really, as a society, have to shift the conversation outside of mental illness to really mental health. And mental illness reinforces the idea that the only wound and is is those who are biologically, chemically imbalanced, and that there's not mental wounds that come also from our sociological ordering. And that mental health is a social and a global conversation, not something specifically about only those who have a chemical imbalance in their life.
Okay, point well taken. My prediction for 2013, iPhones. They will have another generation of that. In iPads, they'll have another generation of that, right? You know, and people will stand up online. But I think very seriously, I think we're going to see the empire holders do an overreach, and that overreach is going to result in calamity for them. I think the greed, people's greed, the weight of it is going to collapse on them. I see it happening in a lot of places. I think there's a certain arrogance that it won't happen, and I think it really will. I also think that many people are going to rise to the occasion, as we've had in the past, and I think you'll see that in a very bold and a very exciting way, ways that I think many of us don't. You know, we're kind of caught up in the inertia, but I just see a sea change coming. I see winning. You know, to quote Charlie Sheen, winning with the little hashtag, and it's going to be us in 2013. That's how I see it going down, and I'm ready for it. I'm excited about it, and I think the conversations that we're going to have are going to reflect that sort of anticipation of a brighter tomorrow coming. So that's how I'm seeing 2013, and I want to thank our guests for being on here. Good luck in the new year, everybody. See you on the other side, because we got big doings popping off in 2013. So we're out for now. Peace.